been used to measure orientation is they just administer, they're like, what best describes your sexual attractions? And it's like, oh, okay, I'm a 1, or I'm a 4, I'm a 6, and that's just supposed to be what you are. That describes you. And my feeling is, okay, what if we take the Kinsey scale, kind of turn it on its side, and think about it as something over time, and measure it over time. That gives us a different way of thinking about it, right? So if you're a Kinsey 3, we used to think, oh, you're a Kinsey 3, that's just what you are. You're a Kinsey 3, you'll be a Kinsey 3 forever. But what if instead, this might be a Kinsey 3, right? That you might have, in addition to an equilibrium point, your overall pattern, you might have a certain pattern of variation around that point. It could be small, it could be large, right? Those could be 2 different types of bisexual women. Or it could be quite small. You could be extremely stable. You could be up here as a lesbian and have a certain pattern, or you could have a more variable pattern, right? So that the equilibrium point, and here's someone who could be mostly straight, could be like that. So the average equilibrium point around which you vary is certainly one relevant parameter to think about when we think about dividing up women with different orientations. But this cycle of variation might be an additional parameter, one that we've never really looked at and never taken seriously, right? So just to show you how this might work, these are 2 women in my study, Amy and Jennifer. Both of them, over the 15 years of the study, had an average of 94% of their attractions for women. But that obviously doesn't, provide the last word on what they experienced, right? Amy is a pretty stable 94. Jennifer went up and down, right? So just knowing that they were 94% lesbians doesn't tell you everything you need to know to understand their pattern. Same thing with Alice and Sarah. These are both women whose average over the 15 years of the study was 50%. They are very different types of 50% women, right? With potentially very different life courses and different patterns of relationships. So what I would like to argue is that as we sort of try and make sense of sexual fluidity and female sexuality, we might have to think about a broader set of parameters, right? The old way of thinking about it was you're a Kinsey 6, you're a Kinsey 1, this is your pattern. Now, if we look at those curves, we can actually kind of borrow from motion dynamics to understand different things about women's sexuality. So in those typical sort of sine waves, you have the equilibrium point, right? The point around which you vary. And then how wide is the variation? That's basically amplitude. How far away do you get from your equilibrium point? Velocity, which simply refers to how long does it take you to move through one complete cycle? Away from equilibrium, back through it, down, and then back again. 1 year, 2 years, a week? Acceleration, right? Does that time period become shorter over time? Does it stretch out? How does that undergo change in the life course? It also, I think, provides an interesting way to think about these big sort of phase transitions where women undergo more abrupt transitions, right? So we put Eleanor back up here. Is she like less likely to end up sexually involved with her male best friend if she looks like this than if she looks like this, right? Is the degree of oscillation, is that an index of how fluid you are, of how sensitive you are to situational circumstances? Might that help us distinguish between a fluid lesbian and a bisexual lesbian? So just to sort of sum up, I think that we're now at a point we really do need to rethink the way that we measure and conceptualize desire, right? It's clearly not this uniform construct. It's more complicated than we have historically thought. And change, dynamism, oscillation might not be this fluky thing that happens to some women when they go to college. Change might be a fundamental part of the system, a fundamental part of the system that is part of the nature of sexual orientation. That, I think, has implications for what we think about as normal and dysfunctional sexual functioning in women. I think it also raises a lot of questions about what exactly the differences between men and women are. I've been talking about women because I've been studying women, but a lot of folks have said to me, you know what, men are probably a lot more fluid than we give them credit for. And I am sure that that's the case. But how different are they? We don't know. People were always bugging me to do a longitudinal study of men. I was like, I have no time. Like, I'm a handful. Someone's like, you do it. I'm like, no. However, I have started doing the hormone study with men as well. So we finished data collection on women. So now we have men keeping track of their attractions for 30 days and also providing saliva samples for their testosterone levels. And it'll be interesting to see if you find the same sort of day-by-day variability in men desires that you find in women, because the question of how big that gender difference is, I believe there is a gender difference, but I'm sort of agnostic on how big it is. I think it's possible that they're more similar to women than we think, we just haven't studied it. I also think the life course is really relevant here. One of the things that's been really fascinating for me in terms of following the sample of women over the past 15 years is that they're going through big life transitions that are definitely affecting their sexual desires, mainly childbirth and having children. So with some of the women, I would follow up and I'm like, oh, so tell me about what's changed in your sexual attractions. And one woman was like, sexual attraction. I can't even remember what that feels like. I have 2 kids, I have a 3rd on the way, like, I can't even, like, desire, schmire, like, where, and for some of them, it's you know, something that causes them to sort of question their sexuality. They're like, I've based my whole identity on being a lesbian, and being a lesbian means being attracted to women, but right now I'm not attracted to anything. Like, what does that mean, you know, and what happens to my identity when that fluctuates? So it's really interesting to think about whether that sort of pattern of oscillation is sensitive to life course transitions, whether it gets bigger or smaller as women move through their 30s and 40s and 50s, whether it's sensitive to menopause, right, whether it's sensitive to those sorts of things. Another thing that I think is really sort of interesting and relevant is that one of the things that happens when you go on birth control pills is it stabilizes your estrogen levels perfectly, right? And it's long been known and sort of quietly discussed in the medical literature that a lot of women go on birth control pills and they're like, yeah, great, my libido's gone. Like, that's a great pill. Now I can't get pregnant, but now I don't want to do the behavior that was going to get me pregnant to begin with. And some have argued that there's something about that flattening of the hormone cycle that might be a little bit deadening to sexual arousal. This, I think, is really interesting because it suggests that when we think about all the forms of hormonal supplementation that doctors are thinking about in terms of estrogen replacement therapy and menopause and birth control, we have to take seriously whether by flattening some of these things, we're actually having a pretty profound effect on women's sexual desires, and whether that's something that we want to think about and sort of question. So my hope is that in the future, we won't have these rigid categories like I'm a lesbian, I'm a bisexual. We might have these more diverse categories. I'm a lesbian on a 2-year cycle. Rather interesting.